Hi, everybody. It is a joy and a privilege to be speaking to you in person this morning. I'm still not over that, by the way, even though it's 2023. It's really awesome to be in the room with everybody today. So yes, today I'm going to talk about the people who manage IT at libraries. So if you've ever seen like a public computer at a library, the people who manage those, done in collaboration with all of my fabulous co-authors from Maryland, myself, Alan, Samuel, and Michelle, from NYU, Rachel, and from George Mason, Nora. So libraries stand at the forefront of the privacy of their patrons. So a few examples, and I'm talking about the US specifically here today. The Department of Homeland Security in 2015 sought to bar use of Tor in libraries. In the same year, the FBI also attempted to subpoena patron records using a provision of the Patriot Act. And sort of in general, modern surveillance capitalism would love to know the things that people in libraries are doing all the time for advertising and other purposes. And libraries care a lot about these things. So why did we talk to library IT staff in particular? So libraries actually offer critical digital services for people like computer access and Wi-Fi, especially for people who have few resources, right? Like if you don't have a computer, but you need to file your taxes or work on a resume, you might go to a library because they have publicly available computers with tools and things like that that you can use. Now, unsurprisingly, library IT staff have small teams and low budgets, but the decisions that they make directly influence their patrons' digital safety because they are managing these systems. So in this work, we asked what kind of privacy tools and strategies, if any, do library IT staff provide for their patrons and why? So in order to talk to these folks, we sent a bunch of direct emails to public addresses, everybody's favorite thing to do. We also posted on public fora like Reddit and Twitter. I did not change the logo. That is a deliberate decision. And of course, after talking to those people, we asked them to talk to their colleagues and speak to us. After a short screening survey, we ended up speaking with 12 participants from a variety of types of libraries, everything from somebody who was the director of a small rural library and the IT person in a staff of maybe 3 total people, to people who worked in large metropolitan systems with many branches and actual full IT teams. So a broad range, which is described in the paper in more detail, of course. So once we did those interviews, we used a strategy called reflexive thematic analysis, where myself and Alan iteratively coded a bunch of interviews and looked for common themes, which I will describe to you now. So first and foremost, what exactly do library IT staff do? Their first and primary responsibility is managing the resources of the library, as you might expect. So this includes public PC management, print, copy, and fax systems, which are also very valuable services if you don't have a printer at home, like myself, frankly, and managing digital resources, so things like access to JSTOR or other or Overdrive or academic journals, ebooks, all that kind of thing. In addition, they also provide assistance to their patrons. So some of our patrons actually did formal digital skills classes, whereas others did things like ad hoc troubleshooting. One participant memorably described trying to do their job and working on a computer, and people would just walk up to them and ask them questions, but they answered them anyway. So they do a little bit of ad hoc work in that way. So while doing these responsibilities, they have, I guess, 3 primary goals. The first is utility of these things, maintaining the resources, make sure they work, make sure that patrons can and know how to use them. The second one is protection, both of patrons' privacy, but also library infrastructure, preventing ransomware attacks or things like that. And they do these things while keeping a set of values in mind, and this is something that came up nearly universally. So our participants described libraries as being considered safe spaces in relationship to other US government institutions, more trusted than most in the modern day, and they often referred to library values of intellectual freedom and freedom from surveillance as core conceptions when they were doing their jobs. So they, of course, face some threats. The first is, as I mentioned, risk to infrastructure, including both, I guess you would call them almost insider threats, attacks from patrons and ransomware. Now, you might think patron attacks are very important. They are not. They are almost unheard of. The one example in our data set was teenagers who had just learned how to scan a local network and sort of did it just for fun and to see that if they could. Additionally, ransomware attacks were actually a decently common threat, but interestingly, none of our participants had personally experienced them. But you could easily find news stories about this, and they had known colleagues and friends who had heard about them. Now, a more prevalent concern, according to our patients, was data collection of various types. So the sort of first concern in this category is third-party vendors. This is a common threat that was nearly impossible to avoid by the simple fact that once you log into a service through a library computer, the IT staff can't control what you put in. You can provide as much personal information as you want to, and they can't do anything about that. And they also don't have a lot of leverage to influence the policies of those third-party vendors. Additionally, requests from police were a common worry. Things both standard law enforcement, but also things like immigrations and customs enforcement. This was a very common worry, and the sort of overarching strategy to deal with that was not keeping any data. So completely wiping computers so that they didn't have anything to turn over if a legal subpoena was issued to them. So when managing all of these factors, we identified some really key tensions that these IT staff members have to deal with. The first is the tension between patron privacy and protecting library infrastructure. So as I mentioned, patrons could harm library infrastructure if they wanted to, right? Somebody could maybe install a keylogger or do some kind of other attack based on access to the hardware, which is usually just out there for everybody to see. One strategy that one could do would be, including monitoring software of some kind, which would allow attribution in the event of attack. But what we found is that library IT staff actually rarely do this. And they are very lenient and record very little about what their patrons do on computers. So as participant 7 describes, if it's a desktop computer, they can just sit down and use it. We have no sign-in process or sign-up process of any kind. Now, I should say this is the exception rather than the norm, but I think illustrates this concept pretty clearly. A lot of other places will have something like you use your library card to log in. There's not that much information attached to it, and the session is still reset at the end. So what we find here is that privacy trumps risks to library infrastructure. Now, the other sort of primary tension that I want to talk about is patron privacy versus utility of services, which was something that came up over and over again. So a common practice for managing the security of these PCs is to use usually a program called Deep Freeze, although some people had open source alternatives, to completely reset the disk image after a session. So what will usually happen is you'll sit down, you'll get an hour of time at a library, and then afterwards it'll reset to some sort of standard image. This has the benefit, of course, of removing patron records like browsing history and documents, but what if you don't have your own PC at home? As participant 4 describes, I remember a situation where the person had just saved their resume to desktop. They didn't ask for a time extension before it ended, and so she lost everything and she had to start over. This is not a concern that you have to have if you have the ability to have computing devices in your home, but if you're doing critical tasks and you lose it, that is not good. That is a tension. So what we find here is that privacy, which we normally consider, well, maybe not normally, but often considered an unalloyed good, actually trumps the utility of the services that these patrons rely on to do really important things. So the impact of these privacy trade-offs is really interesting. So a lot of work that uses the phrase, when we talk about the digital divide, we often focus on raw access, whether or not somebody has access to the internet or access to computing resources. And this is, of course, necessary, but not sufficient to talk about the sort of full spectrum of what it means to have access to computer technologies. And as we illustrated, utility is crucial to participants' patrons. I should stress, we didn't speak to the patrons directly, but many, many stories about how this utility is important. But we find that privacy, especially in the context of these values of intellectual freedom and freedom from surveillance, often trumps utility. Now, this is not new. We are not the first people to discover this. Esther Hargitay wrote about internet skills as an important element of digital access in 2002. And we actually use a framework from Amartya Sen, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, talking about capabilities, which I don't have time to describe that today, but talks about the ability of people to do what they need to do as the core concept rather than raw infrastructure. So, to sum it up, library IT staff balance utility, privacy, and library values, and what we find is that privacy and utility strongly compete for priority in these decisions, and we are in need of strategies and potentially tooling to navigate these tensions. So I would like to thank all my collaborators from the listed institutions, and if you have any hard question, you should ask Alan and not me. I'm just kidding. I'm happy to take your questions now. Thank you.